My name is Rahul. I'm an office employee. Nothing special about my desk. A laptop, a coffee mug with a crack running down one side, a stack of files I never quite finished clearing. If you walked past me in the hallway, you wouldn't look twice. That's exactly the point. 3 years ago, that wasn't true. 3 years ago, I was the guy everyone looked twice at. I had just gotten my first big promotion. My salary jumped almost overnight. And like anyone who's spent years watching other people enjoy nice things while I counted coins for the bus, I wanted the world to know I'd made it. So I did what felt natural. I bought a new phone, the latest model, the one with the camera everyone was talking about. I upgraded my watch. I started taking the office out for lunch on Fridays, insisting on paying every single time. I bought a leather jacket I didn't need for a wedding I wasn't even that close to the couple in. I told myself I was investing in my image. Word spreads fast in an office. Within 2 months, everyone knew Rahul had money now. And that's when things started to shift, not in the way I expected. My cousin, who I hadn't heard from in over a year, suddenly called to catch up. The conversation ended with him just asking, only if it's convenient, for a loan to fix his bike. A colleague I barely spoke to at work started sitting next to me at lunch, laughing a little too hard at my jokes, before eventually asking if I could help him out, until his salary came in. My landlord, sensing an opportunity, brought up a rent increase. Given how well things seemed to be going for you, even distant relatives I saw twice a year began treating me differently, warmer, friendlier, and always circling back to money. Someone's daughter's school fees. Someone's father's hospital bill. Someone's business that just needed a small push. I said yes more times than I want to admit. Partly because I felt guilty saying no when I supposedly had it. Partly because I didn't want to be seen as selfish, or worse, as someone who forgot where he came from. But every time I gave, it wasn't from abundance, it was from the illusion of abundance I had built for myself. I was performing wealth I didn't actually have banked away. I was spending money to look successful, and then bleeding more money because I looked successful. It took me almost a year and a very empty savings account to understand what was actually happening. I hadn't become wealthy. I had become visible. And visibility, when it comes to money, is expensive in ways that have nothing to do with price tags. That's when I started paying attention to something I never noticed before. The people around me who actually had money. Not the ones who looked like they had money. The real ones. There was a senior manager at our company, a man who'd clearly been comfortable for a long time. He drove an old sedan, the kind you'd expect a mid-level employee to drive, not a director. He wore the same 3 or 4 shirts on rotation. He packed his own lunch most days. If you didn't know better, you'd assume he was just another guy grinding through the month like the rest of us. But I found out, almost by accident, that he owned 2 properties outright and had investments that would take most of us decades to build. Nobody in the office asked him for loans. Nobody expected him to pick up every check. Nobody eyed his lifestyle and quietly resented him. He had built real wealth, and he had done it while remaining almost invisible. I started noticing this pattern everywhere once I knew what to look for. The genuinely wealthy people around me weren't the loudest. They weren't the ones with the newest phones or the flashiest weekend plans posted online. Many of them, if anything, looked slightly behind the trend. Driving cars a few years old, wearing clothes that were clearly bought for function rather than display, eating at the same modest places rather than chasing the newest restaurant everyone was talking about. Meanwhile, the people constantly showing off, new gadgets every few months, vacations every quarter, brand name everything, were, more often than not, the same people quietly asking to borrow money by month's end. That contrast changed something in me. I realized that looking rich and being rich are not just different things, they're often opposites. Every rupee spent signaling wealth is a rupee that isn't compounding, isn't saving, isn't protecting you the day an emergency actually shows up. And worse, that signal doesn't just cost you money once. It costs you ongoing money, because it invites requests, expectations, and social pressure that never seem to stop once people believe you have more than you're actually spending. So I made a decision. I was going to become invisible again. Not poor, invisible. I stopped upgrading my phone every year and kept using the one I had until it genuinely stopped working. I started packing lunch instead of eating out with the team every day, framing it simply as trying to eat healthier, rather than making it about money at all. I let my wardrobe stay simple, clean, decent, professional, but nothing that screamed status. I quietly redirected the money I used to spend on appearances into an investment account that I checked maybe once a month, never mentioned to anyone, and let grow in the background of my very ordinary-looking life. The change in how people treated me was almost immediate, and honestly a little humbling. The requests for loans dried up. My cousin stopped calling as often. Colleagues stopped assuming I'd cover the bill. Nobody brought up rent increases based on my supposed success. I had, without saying a word, removed myself from that invisible tax that visible wealth quietly imposes on everyone who displays it. But here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't become less respected. If anything, people started respecting my judgment more, not less. Because when you're not performing wealth, you're forced to actually build substance instead, real skills, real savings, real decisions made quietly and competently instead of loudly and impulsively. I started reading more about how money actually works instead of how money is supposed to look. I learned about compounding, about how small consistent amounts invested early beat large impulsive purchases made to impress people who, frankly, weren't paying as much attention to me as I imagined. That's the strange truth about the power of invisibility. Most people are so busy managing how they're perceived by others that they forget almost nobody is thinking about them nearly as much as they think. I used to believe that if I didn't show signs of success, people would assume I was failing. In reality, most people barely register your financial status unless you actively broadcast it. The pressure to look successful is almost entirely self-imposed, reinforced by a culture that equates visible spending with achievement, when the two often have nothing to do with each other. Today, 3 years later, my life looks almost identical from the outside to how it looked when I first got that promotion. Same modest wardrobe, same reliable but unremarkable phone, same simple lunches. But underneath that unremarkable surface, everything has changed. I have savings that would have seemed impossible back then. I have investments quietly growing every month. I have the freedom that comes from not owing anyone an explanation for how I spend or don't spend my money, because nobody assumes there's anything to ask for in the first place. I think about that senior manager often, the one with the old sedan and the packed lunches. I understand him now in a way I couldn't back when I was chasing the appearance of success. He wasn't hiding out of shame or stinginess. He was protecting something valuable by keeping it quiet. Wealth, real wealth, doesn't need an audience. In fact, an audience is often the biggest threat to it, inviting comparison, resentment, requests, and the constant pressure to keep performing a lifestyle that was never sustainable to begin with. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone starting to earn more money, anyone tempted to finally show the world, I've made it, it would be this. The moment you start looking successful is often the moment your money starts working against you instead of for you. Every visible upgrade invites 100 invisible costs, social debts, expectations, and pressure that compound just as surely as interest does, except in the wrong direction. Looking poor, or at least looking ordinary, isn't about denying yourself the fruits of your hard work. It's about choosing when and how those fruits become visible, usually much later, on your own terms, once the foundation is actually strong enough to support it. It's about understanding that the most valuable thing you can build isn't a lifestyle people admire from a distance. It's a financial position so secure that you no longer need anyone's admiration to feel like you've succeeded. I'm still that same office employee with the cracked coffee mug and the unremarkable desk. Nobody looking at me would guess a thing. And these days, that's not something I'm ashamed of. That's exactly the plan.